Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Growing more with less is the mantra of Nebraska's corn farmers, and they're using incredible technology to do it. Soil moisture monitors let them know when their crop needs water and how much. GPS systems eliminate overlaps in the field, saving fuel and money. New hybrids reduce the use of pesticides and increase yields. When you're talking new technology and innovation, Nebraska corn farmers are all ears. Nebraska's family corn farmers, sustaining innovation.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Doug Simon looks ahead to the USDA's January crop report. Tina Barrett explains details of recently passed tax legislation. Karla Jenkins describes how sugar beets can be used in feeding diets, and Scott Brown reviews current hog inventory levels. Doug Simon from Tredas is our corn and soybean market analyst this week. The U.S. Department of Agriculture next week will release its final numbers for the 2017 U.S. harvest. After its initial projection in August, the agency increased its corn production estimate in each of the 3 following months. November's projection of 14.6 billion bushels was 3% larger than the original number. The USDA's soybean expectation in November was 1% bigger than in August. We talked with Doug Wednesday afternoon about his thoughts leading up to the guesses on production, supply and demand, and grain stocks, but we started by asking how corn and soybean markets entered the first week of 2018.
It's been pretty quiet in both the corn and the bean market. We're $3.53 on the March corn, and we're maybe 6 cents off the recent low. And beans, back at the Power and Farming show that we had in December, we were up in the 10.25 on Novi 18 beans. We're probably about 40 cents lower than that. We've rallied back a little bit on the beans, but it's been really quiet in the corn market lately.
The only positive thing right now is really the wheat market because?
Well, it's cold. It's been dry. Kansas wheat conditions are 37% good to excellent, which we haven't seen that low a number in 5 years. In fact, you have to go back to 2012 when it was about 24% good to excellent. So there's a little bit of life. If you look at all the corn, beans, and the wheat, the commodity funds are short. And with everybody being so negative there, we're due to get some dead cat bounces in there at some point. I think one of the things we were talking about before the show was that FC Stone had a report out on March corn, showed that the average kind of bounce in prices from that low to the end of March was basically about 31 cents over the last 3 years. I think over the 5-year period, it was about 40 cents, and over the last 12 years, it was up toward 80 cents. But that goes back when we had the big rallies into 2012. So, you know, even if you just look here at the last 3 years, we've had some modest rallies. So you'd hope we'd be able to, with these low levels and quietness and low volatility, that would give way to a little more excitement at some point here into the spring.
Well, some of that could come in South America. What do the current weather conditions look like there?
They're having La Nina conditions, cold temps out in the Pacific, and which will have some bearing on our crops here in Nebraska, you know, in the upcoming year. But tends to leave them a little drier, a little hotter, and that's definitely been the case in Argentina. There are some areas of Brazil that are normal to above normal rainfall, but just going forward in the different forecasts here, it looks like it's going to continue to be warm there and dry in Argentina. Not that it's a massive drought, but it's definitely a little less than ideal there.
Their critical period would be when?
It's definitely coming up now. I mean, we're similar to the May through June, July timeframe. I mean, Argentina, Brazil, that's a big span there. Different crops that are going in, but it's definitely a critical period, and that's why everybody's paying attention to the weather in South America right now.
So back here in the U.S., have exports picked up at all for corn or soybeans?
Well, they've been lagging where we'd like to see them. Our export pace on the beans and the corn, beans are lagging about 15 points versus the 5-year average, and the corn's about 3 points below the 5-year average. They're both a little disappointing. USDA actually bumped up the bean exports versus last year, so they have higher expectations, so they're lagging. They're worse off on the beans. And the corn numbers are actually down because of the fact that we had such a big export dock last year. because we had that safrinha crop in Brazil that was low from 2 years ago. We've had a really good export opportunity.
Domestic demand?
Domestic demand's been good. USDA had bumped up both our ethanol use and our livestock use in the WASDE numbers this year, so those are good. We've had pretty good, I think feeding conditions this last fall, early winter. It's been relatively dry. It's been relatively warm except for this last period here. Haven't been, carrying a lot of mud on cattle, so it's been, the feeding conditions have been pretty good. Ethanol side of it, we've had tremendous production on the ethanol side, although recently here, ethanol margins have been pretty low, actually negative if you look at average numbers from Iowa. Those numbers are not encouraging, but ethanol prices have bumped up about a dime here, which maybe will put those, closer back to the average ethanol plants, put them back on average, kind of a break-even number, hopefully.
Corn and soybean basis levels, have they improved at all?
We've seen the basis levels improve dramatically from harvest on corn. If you looked at some of the Council Bluffs market, they were 40 under for gut slot harvest versus the Dees. Right now, they're trading more toward 18 to 20 under the March. With that 12 cents a carry, that 40 under the Dees is equivalent to 52 under the March. So if we're going to 52 to the 18, that's over 30 cents of basis improvement that we've seen. Beans, we've also seen probably a 20 to 30 cent improvement on the bean basis. When you look at those November numbers, now everybody's out versus the March. There's about 20 odd cents a carry to the March, and we're a little firmer on our basis. So it's definitely improving their opportunities there to move some corn and beans.
We have a slew of data coming out on Friday, January 12th, stocks, production, and production in South America. What do you think the strategy should be going into the report and trying to come out of the report?
Well, one of the things that we're seeing right now, because the markets are so quiet and so low in volatility, is that options are relatively cheap. Corn and bean option volatility typically be running at 20 to 22% this time of the year. Right now it's about about 10%. So with that, options are cheap. So if you have some doubts about what you want to do, if you need to sell corn, for example, the basis levels right now on corn and beans are good. We've had cold weather, the basis levels have firmed up appreciably. Move the corn. If you don't like it because you didn't pre-harvest sell last year, then go out and re-own it by using those calls. Those calls are 5 cents against the March, something that's close to the money. If you go to the May, they're closer to a dime. Typically they'd be twice that. So it's a lot cheaper than commercial storage. And it's a good way, because what's going to happen if the futures rally? If we do get that rally in the March board like we're hoping, what's going to happen to the basis? It's likely to widen. So you have to decouple that futures and basis decision. We always talk about that when we talk about futures basis carry. You got to look at those things separately. If you're doing pre-harvest marketing, you got to sell futures ahead of time, set your basis later. This is a time of year where maybe you have to set your basis and do something on your futures later.
Next week, Mike Briggs will join us to look at cattle markets. Recently passed tax reform legislation may impact planning on the farm or ranch. Nebraska Farm Business Inc's Tina Barrett joined us earlier this week to discuss some key aspects of the bill. One issue that received significant media attention was the new $10,000 deduction cap for state and local taxes. Tina says that caused confusion among landowners who thought the cap applied to business real estate and wondered if they should prepay those property taxes.
Well, I think that was one of the biggest things that was missed in all those news stories, that the property tax that they were talking about is your property taxes on your personal residence that we would deduct on Schedule A. Has absolutely nothing to do with business real estate taxes. So there would seem to be a lot of concern and almost panic about needing to get those property taxes paid or being limited to $10,000 next year. And again, that only applies to that state income tax and personal real estate taxes on your personal residence that you would file on Schedule A, which would be your itemized deduction. So it has nothing to do with that Schedule F stuff. And there's also been, there was also rumors about business interest being eliminated, but again, no issue there unless you gross more than 25 million. And then there's some special rules we have to follow. So if that affects you, then you'll want to take a peek at that. But for the most part, business real estate tax and interest are just the same.
Tell me how this legislation changes what you can do with deductions.
Yeah, so let's think about the standard deduction has been about $12,000 for a married filing joint couple. They've raised that to $24,000. So that's a nice thing. And the idea was to eliminate how many people needed to itemize. Okay, and so that's a good thing. It is going to reduce that a lot. So there's a couple things that we need to think about in there. One of that was potentially prepaying those personal real estate taxes. Another thing is potentially changing the way you do charitable contributions. So we've always had the ability with farmers to be able to give grain instead of cash to any qualified charity, have that not show up on your Schedule F. So if your standard deductions is going to be the way to go for a while here, you might want to consider switching those gifts to grain this year. So again, some simple rules to follow, so make sure you contact your tax advisor on that, but might be something to think about.
Depreciation changes in what way?
So we got basically unlimited depreciation. They took the 179 limit from $500,000 to $1 million, brought bonus back in at 100%, said the bonus could be on new or used property, and that's 100% no limit. So we basically have unlimited depreciation. The trade-off, the reason they went that way, was because they eliminated the 1031 exchanges on personal property. So we always think about 1031 exchanges with real estate, but when you trade a tractor in and don't pay tax on that gain, you're doing a 1031 exchange, and most people don't realize that that's what they were doing. So when you go to trade that tractor now, we're going to have to recognize the gain, but we're going to have that offset in depreciation to make up for that. There's going to be some issues on the state's side of that, but some be personalized as we go.
How did the tax rates change for businesses here?
So a couple things that we talk about and hear different things for that. There's the corporate rate. So the C corporations that pay their own taxes, they have a flat 21% rate. They had a graduated scale that peaked at 39%. So now it's flat 21, which is nice and simple. A lot of the producers that we work with use the 15% bracket in that corporate one, and that was about all we used. So those guys are going to actually see a tax increase because from $1 they're going to pay 21%. But the benefit of someday getting out of those C corps with a flat 21% is a real benefit. So there's a trade-off from right now, but it'll be a benefit in the long run. Then the other thing that we're hearing about is the pass-through entities. So this is S corps, partnerships, and then the Schedule Cs and Schedule Fs that are sole proprietors that really aren't pass-throughs, but they're falling under this law. And we're getting a 20% deduction on that. Lots of rules, lots of things that trigger into this. Pretty simple if you're making less than $315,000 a year. More complicated if you're making more than that. This looks like it could be a huge deduction for some producers. So it's really kind of an exciting thing. Biggest difference, the deduction for the pass-through entities and Schedule Fs is set to sunset, where the 21% for C corporations was made permanent.
Next week, Tina will join us again to further explain the elimination of the 1031 exchanges on personal property. Researchers at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln are studying whether sugar beets can be a viable component in beef cattle diets. Largely grown in the state's panhandle, sugar beets can sometimes be unusable for human consumption or too plentiful in supply. Nebraska Extension's Karla Jenkins has worked with sugar beets in gestating beef cow diets and is now looking at their use in growing and finishing cattle. We recently talked with Karla to learn more about the results from that work and the background of why researchers are trying to utilize sugar beets.
So we're researching sugar beets in beef cattle diets because there are times that the sugar beets are not going to make the standard necessary for human consumption. And so then we have some leftover sugar beets that need to go somewhere, and that creates a little bit of a problem for the sugar factory as well as the sugar beet grower. And that may be a good benefit for the beef cattle producer if they know how much to put in it. And then the other reason is that there are times that we just produce more sugar beets than the government will allow sugar to be made from, because there's also a certain amount of sugar that has to come from sugar cane. So if we have bumper crops, we can get a little on the long side of the sugar.
So tell me about the process to use these in a diet.
So to use them in a diet, we need to get them chopped up because they are the complete sugar beet, which is different from beet pulp, which most people are familiar with, and that's a byproduct after the sugar's been taken out. Beet pulp has about 45% neutral detergent fiber. Sugar beets, as the whole sugar beet, only has about 15, so it's got characteristics that can impact the rumen much like corn rather than a fiber source. So we want to chop those up because a whole sugar beet might be choked on. And then we need to get them out of the ground and get them stored and processed. And so while there's nutritionally, they could easily be fed fresh as a chopped sugar beet, we really can't store them that way very long. And so what we've done is we've mixed them with, so it's about 90% sugar beet, chopped up sugar beets, and 10% wheat straw ground wheat straw on an as-is basis and packed that into an ag bag, and we did one small group in a bunker, and just try to get all the air out of it to store it until we could use it, because the sugar beets need to be preserved as quickly as we can.
What results have you noticed over the last couple of years here?
So when we did a beef cow study with gestating beef cows, we replaced corn. 20% of the diet was either corn, or in the other diet 20% was the sugar beets, and they performed very similarly to each other, so it was a good energy source for the cows. The study that we're currently undergoing is a growing study, and it's also comparing sugar beets to corn as an energy source, but in this diet it's 44% sugar beets or no sugar beets, and then it's an alfalfa-based diet. And we just got that started the week before Thanksgiving, or the week of Thanksgiving.
In what industries could this be a viable option? So beef cow, dairy as well?
Yes, so in our area, obviously we want to know where it might fit into the growing beef cattle rations and the finishing rations, and so we have a finishing study planned after this growing study. But you're absolutely right, there are regions of the country that struggle to get in corn or to grow corn. It's expensive for the transportation, they can't grow good corn. And so in those regions like Arizona and California and Texas, they've grown the sugar beets and included them in the dairy rations as well, and actually seen a bump in milk production. And so if there's a way our producers could maybe raise the sugar beets, might be instead of just raising them for sugar or for this, or the ones that come up as surplus that we can't use for sugar, if they can grow that crop cheaper than they can grow some other energy crop, they could possibly incorporate those into the dairy rations across the border from us along the Colorado-Nebraska border. There's quite a few dairies coming in there from California, so there might be an opportunity for our producers to supply those dairies with some sugar beets as well.
Karla says there have been challenges involved with using sugar beets, including getting beets chopped, handling them correctly, and packing them to keep sugars. You can learn more about this UNL research in the 2018 Nebraska Beef Cattle Report, available at beef.unl.edu. The January Nebraska Farmer says University of Nebraska-Lincoln researchers have developed a new kind of paternity test that can determine whether a weed is resistant, and if so, how that resistance developed. Over the last 2 years, UNL's team has devised genetic tests to learn whether weeds like shattercane and Johnson grass are resistant to ALS inhibitors. You can read about how their test works in the January Nebraska Farmer. We also have a look at hog markets this week with University of Missouri Extension ag economist Scott Brown. U.S. farmers have continued to churn out huge amounts of pork. USDA slaughter data shows November's pork output was record large for the month. That follows October's number, which wasn't just a record for the month, it was the highest total for any month ever, with data back to the 1940s. The USDA's latest inventory report, released December 22nd, indicates supplies are still abundant. We talked with Scott Tuesday afternoon and began by asking for his thoughts on December's quarterly Hogs and Pigs report.
Well, Jeff, I think we continue to see an increase in all the numbers across that report, about 1% more sows on hand as we looked at the December 1 inventory. I guess for me, most important when you look at sows farrowed that's upcoming for the Dece through May period, up nearly 3%. That tells me we have a lot of pigs that are going to be coming to the marketplace in the latter part of 2018.
Do the larger numbers necessarily indicate producers have been making money?
Well, when I think you look back at 2017, number one, prices for hogs were certainly higher than many of us would have thought early in the year. If you look at the kinds of cost and returns data that we might get from Iowa State University, it would suggest on average producers did make money in 2017. I will say there were a few months in the latter part of the year where we probably saw a little bit of red ink, but frankly 2017 was much better than we thought, and I continue to remind us that $3 or in some cases sub $3 corn on the cost side has been really helpful to that profit equation.
At what point does expansion or the increase in herd growth start to threaten that profitability?
Well, I think the answer to that question lies a lot in terms of what happens on the demand side. You know, if you look at 2018, given where we're headed, we're easily going to talk about another probably 1.3 billion pounds of pork that we're going to produce this year. We need strong demand to be able to handle that additional increase. When you look at it in per capita terms, it looks like we're going to be up about 2 pounds per person here in the United States this year in terms of pork consumption. And to me, that says we could see some weakness in prices. However, that's certainly not what we've experienced thus far, as demand has been more than capable of keeping up with the additional supplies that we saw come to the marketplace in 2017.
Is there a lot of pressure on foreign demand right now, that strong export market that we've seen? Is the industry kind of banking on that to continue?
Jeff, I think we have to keep exports going strong if we're going to handle, again, a lot more supplies coming. You look back at 2017, roughly 2/3 of the additional production that we saw happen in 2017 left the United States. Markets like Mexico, Japan, South Korea all get really important to this mix. You can throw China into that mix as well. And, you know, for 2018, if we're going to move 2/3 of 1.3 billion pounds, we've got a lot of work left to do, and that brings into, you know, into the question a lot about what we do with trade agreements and so forth, with NAFTA renegotiation going on, potentially renegotiation with, you can talk about Japan and Korea as well. All of those things matter a lot, but we need growth in export markets given the kinds of supplies of pork we're going to bring to the market in 2018.
Is there significant concern about NAFTA now?
Well, I think we continue to wonder. I guess I look at it from a pork perspective, and it's hard to think that NAFTA makes us better off if we get a new NAFTA agreement, that is. So we certainly need to hold what we have. When you start to look at some of the cuts that we see occurring, ham prices showed some weakness as we entered the latter part of 2017, and I think part of that had to do with just what we've been shipping to Mexico and their interest in ham. So we can't not talk about NAFTA, and again, I hope we get a successful renegotiation. The last thing we need as we're growing pork supplies as hard as we are this year is a loss of a market for a period of time.
Let's talk about prices. First, SEW prices. Are they attractive right now? What do they indicate about the future?
Yeah, so SEW prices certainly are attractive. You know, as we look here the last few weeks, we've gotten above $50. I will say that's seasonally where we've been. You'd have to go back, though, to 2014 to find a period of time where we've had really higher SEW prices for the industry. But I think, again, when you look at a lot of potentially open pig space, looking for pigs to put in there, as well as very cheap feed, it tells me we may keep SEW prices higher here for a period of time. But I expect some weakness as we get into the second quarter of 2018 as those seasonally start to move lower.
And your thoughts on where market prices go?
Well, it looks like right now we're set up for 2018 to, in many ways, be very close to where we ended up in 2017. I guess over the next month, we could see a little bit of strength. For me, it tends to be this fight between demand and supply that we have going on right now. Belly prices have been very important to where we've seen hog prices go, and we don't have belly prices abnormally too high right now, so if we get some strength in belly markets, I think that continues to give us some help and get us some strength in hog prices as we look over the next month. However, I wouldn't expect major run-ups from where we start the year here, just with those large supplies that are going to continue to be coming to the marketplace.
Now, with this week's weather forecast, here's Nebraska Extension ag climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here we again for the first official forecast of 2018, and during this last 2 weeks we've seen some brutally cold weather invade much of the eastern half of the United States as we've seen a large substantial trough lock into place. This offset much of the warming that we've seen through early December. Even though we've seen the month of December come in above normal across the Central Plains, we reduced our surplus temperatures by about 6 degrees with that 2 weeks of cold stretch. In fact, 2 more days of cold weather like we've seen would have basically brought December in below normal across the state. So that's how close we were to below normal temperatures. Now, as we look to the models, there is some relief in sight, and as we go to those models, the first thing I'll draw your attention to is that big trough has started to pull that snowstorm on the eastern coast and lifting that trough toward the northeast. That's going to allow much warmer air to move into our region, but before that happens, we do have low pressure to our north and to our south that are going to organize and quickly move toward the southeast. So we're going to start to see some snow spreading across the Dakotas as we go through tonight, and that will shift rapidly toward the southeast and primarily impact southern Nebraska and southeast Nebraska as high pressure starts to build in. So we're looking at a chance for snow changing over to possibly a mixture of freezing rain and rain. As you can see, some of that precipitation developing here, but the main core will start to really develop as it moves to the east of us and give once again another shot of significant moisture to portions of the Great Lakes in the northeast as we sit under the influence of high pressure with a weak low showing basically in northeastern portions of Colorado, but no associated moisture with it as the main feed of moisture is down the Gulf Coast. Now we do have this storm coming in as we get into Tuesday. That's going to push some warmer temperatures into the center part of the country. We're actually going to go into above normal status. As a series of low pressure systems start to form in the lee of the Rocky Mountains, just not a lot of moisture feed yet as the main upper air support waves way to the west of us over California. Now by Wednesday, the models are starting to show that this starts to try to lift out across the southwest, and we start to see the low pressure systems trying to organize into a surface low east of the Rocky Mountains, and this will help us feed up moisture to some extent into the central Rockies as that low pressure system starts to spread that moisture eastward. Now the discrepancy in the models is whether this system is going to pass well to our south or it's going to lift toward the northeast. The current models place this system basically to our south, keeping the low pressure system over southern Arkansas. Therefore, the moisture stays well to our north. Yesterday's model runs had this snow line just a little bit farther south, so pay attention. Things could change rather dramatically, and we could be looking at an event that would be accumulating snowfall on Friday. We get back to a northwest flow with basically a slight cool down in temperatures, but nothing outstanding in terms of cold as we see yet another system pushing toward the Pacific Northwest. In terms of temperatures, we start to see the relaxation of this very cold spell, at least in the near term, as warmer temperatures from the west invade much of the eastern United States. In terms of precipitation, that system pulls toward the northeast, leaving us back into a drier pattern and potentially much colder air moving in as we move toward the end of the month.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews are available individually on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. They include information on corn and soybean prices, tax planning, using sugar beets in cattle diets, and hog inventory levels. As always, you can keep up with Market Journal during the week by following us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Next week, Mike Briggs will be our market analyst. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.